We've looked at the whole notion of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, focusing on the tree of knowledge, pre-Eitz Hada'as, being not simply a tree that was in the Garden of Eden, which we haven't yet really looked at closely enough. What was this phenomenon known as the Garden of Eden? But sticking with the pre-Eitz Hada'as, the tree of knowledge, we know that the tree of knowledge was in fact some sort of spiritual force that channeled duality into the human being. And therefore, as a consequence of that, through the eating of the forbidden fruit, there was the internalized struggle between the two tendencies of me orientation, ego, self-satisfaction. So this internalized the struggle within, creating the duality where we have to express two equal and opposite potential tendencies. One is the flow of self, ego, preservation, instinctive survival drive, as it's often referred to, and our higher order self from the Nefesh Elokis, which is the compassionate side, the side of ourselves that wishes to serve others, enters into non-exploitative relationships, and creates the opportunity of really achieving life's fulfillment. Prior to the eating of that forbidden fruit, the energy of duality, or the two energies, weren't operating within. And we're going to understand that a little bit further. What does it mean that there was no notion of inner temptation? However, also as a consequence of that, we entered into a discussion of what was the primordial state that even led up to the tree of knowledge. And we understood something about the early state of chaos, the idea that the spiritual creative energies were contained momentarily within vessels, within containers, which actually shattered because the energy was too great within, creating shards and sparks of spiritual higher reality throughout the realm. And the focus and the goal of the human being was to collect these shards and sparks of higher order energy and return them to the source. The methodology is known as mitzvot, from the Hebrew tzavta or the Aramaic tzavta, which means to connect. Now, having discussed momentarily those particular antecedents, what we want to look at now is what in fact is the agenda of the human being, given that Adam and Chava entered into a state of exile from Gan Eden. What does it mean to be exiled from Gan Eden? What is the purpose of being removed from the more idyllic circumstance where there's a unitary self, where evil and negativity may be recognized but are not part of our internal choice mechanism? Like angels. Angels have a perception of what it is that is good and evil, but are not in any way contaminated by the evil, as was the case of Adam prior to the eating of the forbidden fruit. So today we're going to look at the whole result of being exiled, fighting and struggling with our inner selves, and what the ultimate goal of that is. Two very interesting quotes. Only the misfortune of exile can provide the in-depth understanding and the overview into the realities of the world, by the very famous author Stefan Zweig. In other words, only by being outside of the ideal and being involved in the struggle does a higher reality dawn. It's almost like the challenge is the precondition for happiness and fulfillment. Without the act of overcoming, we can't enjoy to the nth degree what it is that achievement is all about. And another very wonderful quote, seeking to forget makes exile all the longer. The secret of redemption lies in remembrance. How often we strive to forget the negativity, but at the very same time, by contending and confronting the negativity comes our inner liberation. So ironically, it's not the forgetfulness of the hurt and the pain, it's the capacity of transformation of the pain into a much higher positive that provides life's purpose. So these two quotes actually provide us with a nice introduction into the source material. And the source material tonight is going to take us on a travelogue, beginning with Rav Acha of Kfar Trasha. And this is in the Zohar, a little anecdote brought from the Zohar. What did he try to do, this particular master? This wandering master tried to atone for a village that obviously had erred by burning incense. The whole notion of burning incense, or the sense of smell as a spiritual therapeutic mechanism to create right from wrong, and the power of the sense of smell, because as Chassidus explains to us, that of all the five senses, it's the sense of smell that ultimately penetrates deepest into the core. Isn't that ironical? You might have thought sight, you might have thought hearing, but it's the sense of smell. And, you know, sometimes you can actually identify very great profundities through the sense of scent and smell. You're walking in the street, and some scent assails your nose and brings back a childhood memory that otherwise would have for always been buried somewhere deeper in the recesses of the mind. And that came through the sense of smell. Or if, God forbid, someone is unconscious, what do? You don't start calling out their name or shining a light at their eyes. What you do is you give them smelling salts, right? Because the sense of smell penetrates deeper to potentially thereby revive the individual. So this is related very, very much also to the idea of incense, not the common incense that is utilized to create some sort of ambience within an environment, but for example the use of incense in the Holy of Holies, Kodesh Kodeshim, and how that actually was able to create that elevation for the high priest to a point where the ability to come close to Hashem became that much more likely. Anyway, here we have Rav Acha Kfar Trasha, obviously a master who knew the methodology, tried to assist whatever the ills of a particular village were by burning incense, but to no avail. Why? Because there had not been tikkun. Now, we've discussed tikkun. Not it's in rather contemporary, generalized usage out there in the world, in the Jewish world, tikkun meaning any good deed. No, that's not the Kabbalistic teaching of tikkun. That may already be a borrowed generalization from the original Kabbalistic term tikkun. Tikkun, letaken, to fix, to repair, remembering our discussion of the human being as the repair person of the world. Tikkun means to take those shards, sparks of energy from the world of chaos, olam hatohu, and return them to a state through tikkun, fixing the vessel, where the result isn't the original vessel, but something even more profound. So that as we move through life, personal life, collective life, repairing the world in a spiritual fashion that we're talking about, the result will be a spiritual fission point where the whole nature of the world changes to something higher even the state of tohu, chaos, prior to the creation of the Garden of Eden. And that higher fission state we call Mashiach Zeiten, or Zman Mashiach, the time of Mashiach. Mashiach isn't simply some redemptive, idealistic state of being where, as we are explained, the sheep lies, or the lamb lies with the wolf. There will be an eventual change in nature of both animal and human kingdoms, but much more profoundly, a whole change in the nature of the world. One little inkling, which I can give you in a mystical format, the original light of creation was such that it wasn't linear. You would be able to see from one end of the world to the other end of the world. We are explained in our writings. What does that mean? We can't grasp. But nevertheless, the capacity of sight in that particular aura and light allows an all revelatory kind of process, and that's once again will subsist at the time subsequent to the period of Mashiach and onwards. All right, so that's the first little quote. What was it? He would have healed the symptoms by using incense. Incense does the job, but it wouldn't have cured the cause. It would have taken away merely the symptoms. And in order to be able to get back to the source, you have to really return to the cause. We'll see the relevance of this particular source in a moment. The second piece of source material lies in Bereshit, in the first book of the Chumash. It says there, "For sin lies at the door, and all its desire is for you, yet you can rule over it." All right, it's a prose-like statement that the notion of temptation subsequent to the eating of the fruit is such that it's constantly there. There's no such thing as respite. There's only relative respite. And the relative respite only gives us a moment to be able to consider who we are, how we are, and respond with greater strength. You go on a holiday. Why do you go on a holiday? On a vacation. You go on a vacation to take one step backwards from life in order to take two steps forward once you enter life. So the whole thing is a profitable venture in terms of spiritual reawakening. And thereby, as we are able to have moments of respite, it's only to collect ourselves to move forward. We know that sin lies at the door, which means that we're constantly tempted. Yet you can rule over it. We have the capacity, as we've learnt in our other sessions on the book of Tanya, that every one of us has the capacity to be able to overcome our lower order self at every moment of challenge. And we discussed there that the difference between a tzaddik, a perfect master, and someone who struggles may not be behaviorally expressed, may not be seen in the distinctiveness of speech. Both can present identically. Both the master is perfect in his or her presentation in the world, as is the struggling individual called the Beinoni. So what's the difference if they present the same? As we said, one is involved in the struggle, one has gone past the struggle. But the one who's involved in the struggle can always succeed. And that's what the hint is here. You can rule over it. We have the capacity. Then we've got the third statement, and it's taken from the Midrash. And it's in the words of Nachash, the serpent, a very curious creature we're going to have to meet today and discuss. The word Nachash is often translated as the serpent, but we're going to see it's far from being the serpent of the colloquial use of language here. The serpent says to Adam, "Look, Adam, there are higher spiritual mansions you have not yet visited." In other words, there's much more than meets the eye, and only by eating from this forbidden fruit can you be opened up and match the capacity of insight of the gods, of the angels, if not God itself. So there was the first external tempter, and I emphasize external as opposed to internal, which is our reality, our existential condition. And then we come to three interesting quotes that deal with a very curious incident amongst two incidents of temptation. One was the incident whereby a particular son of Jacob, Yehuda, finds himself removed from his brothers from whatever reason, has a business relationship with a local Arab merchant, ends up having a relationship with a woman that he marries, and there's a daughter-in-law, I should say, and the daughter-in-law marries, and the husband dies, and under Jewish law, she's to marry her brother doesn't want to. At any rate, through a surreptitious series of events, this Yehuda ends up having sexual intercourse with his daughter-in-law, not realizing it is his daughter-in-law. It's almost like a Roman drama that one can sometimes read in some of the Shakespearean sonnets. That's one thing, except that from that particular incident, arises the future genealogy of the Messiah. Interesting. And then we have another particular incident where there is temptation. And in this particular incident, we find that Joseph, finds himself in Egypt. And he is a very handsome individual, albeit a slave, elevated somehow miraculously to the court of the Pharaoh, put second in charge, etc., etc., but not before his master's wife, Potiphar's wife, sets her eyes on him and says, "This is the man I want," pursues him romantically. He resists her overtures, and because of the resisting of the overtures, he's able to find himself later on in life elevated to a higher place. And he ends up, strangely enough, marrying this woman's daughter later on, and they also have children, and this also gives rise to a messianic descendant. So you can see out of negativity comes immense potential in a very surreptitious kind of way. From our own confrontation with negativity comes a solution, a product that is higher than what originally a straight course could have conveyed. And that's the beauty of challenge. Through challenge, we grow to a position that goes beyond the normal evolutionary growth of an individual. So in terms of the discussion, we're looking at a word which I'm introducing, which we haven't used before, and that's the word birur. The Hebrew modern equivalent, levarer, usually it means to clarify, to even explain, although it's levaer, which is with an aleph, not levarer, which means to distinguish one thing from the other. The meaning of the word birur, which probably its most exact translation is to distill, a distillation process, is the spiritual equivalent of our war against the thorns and thistles and insects and weeds and the subjugation to the soil in order to eat from it. Adam is removed from the Garden of Eden. Adam is banished. Chava is banished. From then on, no longer does the earth simply produce the idyllic opportunity of simply eating from it without effort, but now we have to till the soil, and we have to weed, and we have to contend with the growths that are not desirable, which is, of course, at the same time a description of our lives. We find ourselves with toxic people, with toxic circumstances, with food that is contaminated by manufacturing processes, breathing air that all too often possesses all the impurities that causes problems within the lungs, drinking water that has been mercury laden because of industry filling the rivers, eating fish that are given the strangest of foods in the lakes to produce in the highest amount of quantity, most unhealthy. We are involved now in the process of birur. Our body does it in a very natural way, unless it's overloaded. Our body does birur. The body separates toxicity from non-toxicity, seeks out what is required for the body from what is not required in the body. What is not required becomes excreted, or it becomes removed through breathing out, or it becomes removed through sweat, or becomes removed in other forms of toxic elimination from the body. But this is part of the birur. At a profoundly spiritual level, including mind and emotion, we're constantly involved in that. What is good advice? What is not good advice? You have to be able, levarer, to distinguish between what it is that we need, what is positive information, what is not just negative information, but today, unnecessary information, overload of information. What do we need to take that actually allows us to progress in life? Today, the way that the media projects at us is, there's so much we have to know and do, and if we don't, we're not living. And the truth is 90%, 99% is totally unnecessary. But this is the world post-Garden of Eden. We're living right there. We're experiencing it to the nth degree because we're living at a point in history just prior to that moment of spiritual fission, which allows everything to be projected to a higher plane. So how do we deal with it? One way to deal with it is to fight it. Fight the evil. Become a knight in shining armor of a spiritual order, a spiritual warrior going out there and fighting and contending with all the evils of the world, be they at the level of bad people, be they in the area of bad air, be they in the area of bad food, whatever it might be. And that certainly is an important function. However, what Kabbalah informs us and Hasidus explains is there's an even more powerful mechanism. And the way it puts it is to add sufficient light so that the shadows then vanish of their own accord. What are the shadows? Shadows is the absence of light because of obstruction. But if you clarify the world, mevarer the world, to a point that it becomes transparent and translucent to the higher light, then the shadows themselves vanish. Our own shadow side ceases to exist because what we exude is only positivity. You know, sometimes you meet someone who is such a positive influence that we just want to bathe in their presence. We want to bathe in their light because, wow, I feel really good. Why? Because they allow their light to envelop us so that our own personal shadows are momentarily removed. So to truly succeed is to practice self-nullification to such an extent where no struggle is needed. The ego creates the greatest shadows. The quest to make myself important in the world, unfortunately, darkens my life. It's when we practice humility, anivut, in an assertive manner. I'm not talking, remember, when we discussed what anivus and humility is, it doesn't mean to allow everyone to step over you. Quite the contrary, because you have a self-belief in terms of your giftedness that Hashem gave you. That's why you're here. That's the whole purpose of reincarnation. Humility means to recognize your gift and assertively confer it on your children, on your friends, on others, etc. But to do it assertively means not to do it boastfully with an egocentric posture of, I'm great, now you better listen to me, or I'm one up on you, which of course is a total exaggeration, but the subtleties of that often come through nevertheless, but rather to recognize that you have the capacity to allow light to flow from you so strongly that the shadows of other people's lives disappear of their own accord. Okay? And that's what we've been given the opportunity as a consequence of Adam and Chava having been removed from Gan Eden, where they only had to contend with good. We now have to overcome the shadows, but in overcoming the shadows, we have to reach to a greater potential of light emanating, and thereby, another way of saying it is, we grow in the process. The result of the laws of chaos that ruled prior to the laws of tikkun and repair. Not only do we repair the vessels to return to the former state, but we have now and are in the process of creating a world that's even greater than the moment of creation itself. And you and I are co-creators of this unfinished universe. So, the reason for exile is to be a spark gatherer. That's who we are. Had exile not occurred, had we did not have galut, exile, which is a term we use in many contexts, in collectively Jewish people exiled from Eretz Israel of old, from the temple. That's a collective state of exile. But you have a highly spiritual form of it, the exile of the Shekhinah. The feminine side of the cosmos is, in fact, the hidden state of presence where we only recognize nature, teva, the external face of reality. The skin hides the fruit, as we said last week. The fruit lies inside, but we only look at the skin at first instance. We have to peel off the skin to get to the fruit. Likewise with life. We look at the external beauty of life, but the truth is only when we peel off that, even the beauty of externality, and sometimes it's not so beautiful at all because it's painful and hurtful and life is really not great at all. When we peel that off, we can come to the fruit. That's what, in a sense, the process of galut, exile, is all about. Had exile not occurred, were we not kicked out from the Garden of Eden, then the candlelight would have simply been absorbed in the orb of the sun's light. Am I hearing bells? It's a beautiful tune you've chosen. That's fine. So, had we not been exiled...
Is it from the Garden of Eden, or is it at the moment?
Galut is at both levels. The spiritual galut that we exist in, which has been superimposed existentially of the galut of the Jewish people from the temple, which also coincides with our personal galut, our personal estrangement in terms of the truth of our soul in the collective souls of 71 souls in the world. So there's multi-levels of the same phenomenon. So, but had it not occurred, then the candlelight would have simply been absorbed in the orb of the sun's light. In other words, if we were constantly living in the sun's light, then we wouldn't have recognized ourselves as the candle. It's only by moving into the relative darkness of golus, of removal, that our own light becomes something of reality, which we can then contribute back to the original. So the purpose of the struggle is to produce something even more and brighter. In the same way as, you're sitting by a fire on a beautiful winter's night, and you're sitting there, and the fire tends to expire. So what do? You take another piece of wood and throw it into the fire. The fire may well be burning, but as soon as you throw another log into the fire, there's a sudden increase of intensity in terms of the light when we add to the existing fire. So what we do is produce through our struggle that extra piece of wood. We are the extra piece of wood that is thrown into the fire, and therefore we make a contribution. Now we come to the source of struggle, and we come across Mr. Nachash, the serpent. Now, what is Nachash? Nachash is a humanoid creature. It's not something slithering on the earth. Haman, that's probably the same source, no? It's Purim tomorrow night, so I've got Purim on my mind. Nachash walks upright on 2 feet. Okay? Nachash is Adam's competitor. But whereas Adam had no internal struggle, the nature of growth for Adam was created by having an external tempter, not an internal tempter. Nachash becomes the source of potential choice for Adam, who doesn't have internal choice. He lives internally an idyllic experience of a perfect master, so to speak. So this Nachash creature is quite different than what we taught as kids. In fact, we're told that Nachash is made up of the same substance as the tree of knowledge. Whatever Nachash is, the substance of Nachash is of the same order as the forbidden fruit. It's interesting. We're talking about a totally different world, the way that we understand it at the deeper levels of Midrash and Kabbalah. And therefore, it's the personification of potential duality that we later internalized. He was the tempter, not internally, but externally to Adam and Chava. And then Adam and Chava, after eating, became like Nachash, in a sense. Nachash was internalized. Nachash contains the same substance as the tree of knowledge. Eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, therefore, takes a dimension of Nachash and brings it into us, each individual through Adam, and who was the progenitor of the human race. And therefore, we feel that notion of temptation. We feel struggle. We feel duality. We live a life where choice needs to be exercised because we now have Nachash as a dimension of our inner being. And we have a lower order self, the Nachash element, called the Nefesh Bahamit, the animalistic tendency of self. And we still retain Adam's original state of Nefesh Elokit, the higher order state of what he experienced in the Garden of Eden. If you could dissect yourself spiritually and remove the Nachash element, you would end up experiencing life like Adam originally was. Or perhaps how a perfect master, a tzaddik gomor, finally is able to reach that state, which is so terribly rare. So, we now can go back to another dualistic description of some of the original states of being. We spoke about the state of Sovev, which we translated as encompassing light, and the state of Mamala, which means the state of the life force flowing through things. What do we mean by that? And I think the way we described it in an earlier discussion is that everything has an energy which maintains its integrity. Unless you have van der Waals forces between molecules, unless you can have atomic structure with positivity and negativity attracting each other, unless you have the protons whizzing, the electrons whizzing around the nuclei where the proton is, etc. Unless you have that structure, doesn't exist. But where does the energy come from in the first place to maintain? Because we know that every system winds down eventually. Energy is lost in the process of motion and movement. And yet, here we are. Everything continues. There's a constant inflow of energy. Inflow. We call that mamala, the filling process. The divine energy that flows through the cosmos to maintain that energy. But that's only a tiny amount of energy. It doesn't take much to run material world. I mean, yeah, for you and I, we need a tremendous amount of energy every day, which we consume for the purpose of running a household, whether it's electrical energy or gas or source or a coal-fired, wind-fired, whatever it might be. But it's still tiny from God's perspective, because there is the vast majority of energy that remains still spread as those sparks that haven't found vessels. And that's called the encompassing light. The only way that we could perhaps describe it is a sense of awe, a sense of wonderment. Like if you enter into some sort of setting, an absolutely beautiful ancient hall that's absolutely magnificent, and you have a sense of awe, of greatness there, or a sense of greatness in the presence of someone. There's something that's encompassing. That's only to use a sort of piece of simile to explain it. Okay, these two states, the states of Mamala, Hashem flowing through an energizing world, and Sovev, Hashem encompassing the world, also can be identified as the difference between knowing and being. What does it mean to know, and what does it mean to be? And this is a very good use of English language in this instance. You know how I'm always down on the English language, how it's so inadequate. In this particular instance, it's very apropos. When you know something, what does it mean to know something? And I emphasize the word know because the whole tree was called the tree of knowing. Eitz Hada'at. What does it mean to know something? To know something means to be so close to it that there's no distance between you and it. For example, if I were to ask you, what is 7 times 6? And you would answer to me 42, wouldn't you? Hopefully. But you would answer 42 just like that. You wouldn't even have to process it, I don't think. You wouldn't have to think it through. You would just know it. You know it. Why? Because it and you have fused into becoming one. So even without processing, because you learnt your timetables so well, initially by rote, as little kids, that you actually infused it within you. To know something means to make it completely blend within you. It is filled within you. That's the aspect of knowing, internalizing it. So when Adam ate from the pre-Eitz Hadas, from the tree of knowing, whatever the knowing of evil is, it became internalized. We now know evil. We know what's bad. Some people say, I just know. And it's true. And you would say, well, what's that process of knowing? Do we call that intuition? Do you call that something that's part of our spiritual makeup? Whatever it is, it's part of us. It's within. And that's the state of knowing. Now, angels are not in the state of knowing. Angels are in the state of being. Now, what does that mean, state of being? In other words, here I am. Here's Ralph seated next to you. next to me. I'm here. Ralph is there. At this very moment, there's nothing particularly happening between us. We're not talking. We're not communicating at this very moment. I'm not even looking at Ralph at this very moment. I'm here. He's there. We're in a state of being. Ralph opens up his mouth and says something to me, and instantaneously I move from being to knowing. He reveals something about himself through voice, through content, through whatever it might be, through his cough. And then as a consequence of that, suddenly I've moved from a relationship of being, I see Ralph, he's there, to knowing. Now Ralph momentarily is an aspect of me. There's something I know. Angels are always in a state of being. They recognize evil. They sit across the road from evil. They know what's right, what's wrong, but it doesn't affect them. Human beings, on the other hand, are knowing creatures as a consequence of eating from the pre-Eitz Hadas. Because of that, we're constantly in a state of relationship with the world. We're constantly in a state of dialogue with life. We're constantly internalizing what it is that living is all about. That's what was both the blessing and the curse of eating from the forbidden fruit, the pre-Eitz Hadas. Isn't that an interesting way of understanding and analyzing the consequence that Chassidus explains in terms of eating from the fruit? So when we say that the angels are in a state of being and we are in a state of knowing, we therefore can succumb to Nachash, as Adam did. Because knowing means dealing with it, involving with it, becoming part of it, contending with it. And that's the nature of our life. For us to overcome the world's negativities, for us to contend with the evils of the world, for us to be able to practice true tikkun means we have to roll up our sleeves and get down into the nitty-gritty of touching it, feeling it, knowing it in every respect. That's the way we have to do it. But by so doing, we grow much more than an angel can. That's why Adam, the human being, is potentially greater than any angel, we're taught. Because an angel will always be in a state of being. Whereas through the very act of knowing, we grow. And we grow to a point beyond angelic innocence. Beyond the innocence that Adam and Chava had prior to eating from the tree of knowledge, the pre-Eitz Hadas. Okay, that's the process of birur. So using the language, we are involved in a process of distillation of good from evil through thought, through speech, and through behavior, through integrating into the world, and by being able to remove the good from the bad, by doing mitzvot, connecting to the good, and removal from the bad, what we're doing is engaging the world in a state of knowing and not standing by like the angels in a state of being. Our lives are more, therefore, convulsive than angelic life is. Angels lead a rather peaceful life, but at the same time, the very fact that we undergo trials and tribulations allows us to elevate to a point far beyond angelic truth. So, why was Nachash so interested in tempting Adam? What was in Nachash's mind? What's Nachash's agenda? The nature of evil is it wants to be noticed. Evil is the height of ego. Evil means I must be noticed in the world. If you look at anybody who has been, even in our contemporary times, one of the very, very unfortunate aspects of copycat mass murders in schools. I just read that another one took place yesterday or the day before in the United States. What is it that often preys on the mind of that student who picks up that semi-automatic, automatic gun and rifle and kills 2, 3, 4, 5 colleagues, and you then investigate, and it's all about recognition? It's all about their lives being lives where they weren't noticed, or they were the 5th child, or the parents simply didn't accord them the recognition, or what have you. And this was their moment of perverse glory. And they understand and know what they're doing. But the temptation of having notoriety, of being noticed, is so great that it overcame any aspect of recognition of sanctity of life. That's the nature of evil, ultimately. Wanting to be noticed. Nachash wanted to be noticed. Adam and Chava, in their state of naivety and innocence, didn't notice Nachash parading around, etc., doing his catapulting and, trying to attract the attention like a little kid, attracting the attention of the teacher, attracting the attention of the parent by being naughty and by using all sorts of ruses of being cheeky and by whatever. And Adam and Chava, no. So Nachash develops this plan. I am going to be noticed. I'm going to take my semi-automatic rifle and I'm going to shoot it up. And it's in the form of the forbidden fruit. We know that you can't eat from it. You know what? If I can get them to eat from it, then I will be noticed. I become part of their life. They'll have to contend with me forevermore. And we do. He succeeds. And that's what goes on, if you will, I put it somewhat simplistically, in the motivation of Nachash as such.
How does he succeed when they're in the perfect, when there is no right or wrong, they just know?
Because their state of, they're not in a state of being like an angel, although the head of Adam, as the Midrash tells us, is located high up in the chambers of the highest worlds. So Adam straddles the highest spiritual mansions, whatever that might mean, and this world as such. But this world also, his feet are on the ground, which is another way of saying that at the very same time he's involved in the physicality of the world. Now you're right. He's in a state of relative perfection. You have to say relative, because anything short of being God itself has imperfection, etc. So relative perfection, you're right. And what was the weakness? The weakness was that he was subject to temptation, but not in a normative way. Not the way that you and I are internally. It only could come from the outside for something utterly good, like you can become as great as God, and you can then do it for the good. There's many ways of doing it. At the end of the day, there's a dilemma. At the end of the day, your question is well placed. How can it be that someone in perfect innocence can become corrupted? And your point remains a point, even though I've given you a secondary kind of a response. So don't think for one moment that I've responded to you. I haven't. The question still remains. But then a lot of questions will remain, and that's why we wait for Mashiach to come and answer these difficult questions. Okay? And we're still waiting in terms of that. Okay, so now we have the struggle that makes us human being, but by being human beings we become more proficient partners in this ongoing process of being co-creators of an unfinished universe. And as I said earlier, the things that sometimes get us really down is the struggle itself. I can say as often as I want that the struggle is important and the pain has a purpose, but the person involved in a struggle and a pain that is within but just up to their limits, it's not pleasant. And how often the Jewish people say to God, you want us to struggle? You struggle. I'm quite happy to be in a state of peace. I don't need all this sorrows. I don't need 2,000 years of exile. I don't need to live in majority communities that don't provide me respect and rights, etc., etc. I don't want that. Thank you, God. It's a wonderful struggle, but keep it. Okay? And yet, here we are. Because somewhere along the line, Hashem, with obviously the greater perspective of the whole, recognizes that we do want it. There are times when we wish we didn't have it, but the end result, when we succeed, and I recognize there are people around the table who are in the process, and they may not even see the possibility of success, whatever that might mean, but nevertheless, we're finite human beings, and Hashem recognizes that the struggle itself results in a reward that we very, very much want to appreciate and to value. And that is yet to come. It isn't necessarily in everyone's life at this very moment. So ironically, out of the most strangest of life's turnings, Whether it be the turning of the life of Joseph, Yosef HaTzadik we call him, Joseph the righteous one. Well, how righteous are you when you happen to be the head servant in the house of Potiphar, being pursued by his wife, etc.? I mean, what's so perfect about that kind of a life? And yet, the result is that Yosef the Tzaddik provides the opportunity for the whole future of the Jewish people to enter to Eretz Yisrael eventually. Becomes the mechanism for it, by providing within Mitzrayim itself, within Egypt, the wherewithal for the future survival of those hundreds of years of servitude, the blueprint that he was able to evolve.
He went to jail for this.
Oh, he was in not just a jail, but it was a hole in the ground. He was in a dungeon, and he had to suffer all the trials and tribulations, and he helps his fellow prisoners and says, don't forget about me when you guys get out, and they forget about him, and he stays longer there. This is Yosef HaTzadik. Has to lead a life of difficulty and challenge. Yeah.
Repeat that sentence. You said he became what?
Yosef HaTzadik. The Yosef the Tzaddik, why do we call him Yosef HaTzadik? Tzaddik means a wonderfully righteous individual who benefits the world. It was he who became the progenitor of the exodus of Egypt.
My point is that by resisting the temptation of Potiphar's wife, he was quite cruelly punished, as you've just enumerated.
Absolutely.
It didn't, yield him any immediate benefit.
No.
Through certain serendipitous acts, he later on became governor.
Yeah, but we don't say it's serendipitous. We say there's a real cause-effect relationship. Were it not because of the struggle, were it not because of those series of events, he would not have been elevated to the place and position where he in fact was becoming the destiny of the Jewish people. That is somehow through his act of choice, acting within the struggle, that created for us the opportunity that you and I have today, or that the Jewish people had in terms of Yitzias Mitzrayim, leaving Egypt itself. So the purpose of our discussion and our session in this particular instance was to begin to identify what the whole purpose of exile from Gan Eden was. Whereas the previous three sessions dealt more with what was the precursor to Gan Eden and what was the dynamic within Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Today we're looking at, well, there was the exile from it, and what's the purpose of the whole exercise anyway? The purpose is highly purposeful. And you and I are going to continue to follow through with that unfinished agenda that Adam and Chava have left us with. Sure, Adam and Chava erred, but at the very same time, having erred and our process of correcting that wrong for eternity until Mashiach time provides for us the opportunity to grow far beyond what Adam and Chava in fact were, and far beyond the angels, and move to a state where the complete fulfillment of being a human being can be discovered.